October 1944, somewhere in northern France, the transport truck lurches to a stop. And Greta Fischer, 23 years old, a signals operator with the Wehrmacht, feels her stomach tighten as the canvas flap pulls back. American soldiers stand outside, rifles slung over shoulders, their expressions unreadable in the pale autumn light. Her fingers move instinctively to the thick blonde braid coiled at the base of her neck, tucking it tighter beneath her field cap. Around her, 11 other women sit in silence, their faces pale, their hands clenched in their laps. They are the first group of female German prisoners to reach this particular Allied processing center. And no one knows what comes next. Greta steps down from the truck, her boots sinking into mud churned by 100 vehicles. The air smells of diesel fuel and wet earth and something cooking, soup, maybe, or coffee. An American sergeant gestures toward a canvas tent marked with a red cross, and the women move forward in a tight cluster, like sheep seeking protection in numbers. Greta's heart hammers against her ribs. She thinks of the stories whispered in foxholes and bunkers during the long retreat westward, stories of what happens to captured women, stories that made grown men lower their voices and look away. She thinks of her mother's last letter, received 3 months ago, urging her to stay safe, to come home. She wonders if she will ever see home again. Inside the tent, rows of cots line the walls, and medical equipment sits arranged on metal tables. An American nurse stands near the entrance, auburn hair pinned beneath a white cap, sleeves rolled to her elbows, a clipboard in her hands. She looks tired but professional, her gaze sweeping across the arriving prisoners with clinical efficiency. Greta notices the nurse's hands first. Clean, steady, the nails trimmed short. Hands that might do anything. The nurse says something in English, and an interpreter, a middle-aged man with a French accent, translates. Remove your caps and outer uniforms for medical examination. The tent falls silent except for the sound of fabric rustling and breath catching in throats. Greta's fingers tremble as she unpins her cap, and her braid tumbles free, heavy and golden in the lamplight. She closes her eyes, waiting for the scissors she knows must be coming. This is when it happens, she thinks. This is when they take everything. But what happens next, what the American nurse does instead, will challenge everything Greta believed about enemies, about war, about what it means to be human when the world has forgotten how. Before we continue this extraordinary true story, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and give this video a like. History deserves to be remembered, and your support helps us bring these forgotten stories to light. Greta expects the scissors. Every woman in that tent expects the scissors. For months, propaganda broadcasts echoed through Wehrmacht barracks, warning of the fate awaiting captured German personnel. The broadcast spoke of humiliation tactics, of enemies who stripped prisoners of dignity before stripping them of anything else. Female soldiers received additional warnings, whispered rather than broadcast, but no less terrifying for their secrecy. In the chaotic final weeks of the German retreat through France, rumors spread faster than accurate information. Women serving in communications, logistics, and support roles heard stories that made them choose death over capture. Stories that transformed every approaching enemy soldier into a potential nightmare. Greta joined the Wehrmacht Signals Corps in early 1943. Trained in radio operation and cipher systems at a facility outside Berlin. She was 19 years old, idealistic in ways that seem impossible now, convinced she served a defensive cause protecting her homeland. Her training emphasized technical precision, Morse code rhythms, frequency bands, encryption protocols, but also reinforced certain beliefs about the enemy. American and British forces, the instructors insisted, fought without honor, without rules, without the codes of conduct that supposedly governed European warfare. These lessons shaped expectations. When Greta's unit received orders to fall back through Belgium and into France during the summer of 1944, those expectations intensified into dread. The other women in the transport truck carried similar fears. Liesel, 21, worked in a field hospital, evacuating wounded soldiers from aid stations, increasingly overrun by advancing Allied forces. Anna, 25, served in an administrative capacity, managing supply requisitions and personnel files. Marguerite, the oldest at 31, operated a switchboard connecting various command posts across the collapsing Western Front. None of them were frontline combatants, but all wore Wehrmacht uniforms. And all understood that uniforms made them targets and, if captured, potentially vulnerable to treatment. They could barely allow themselves to imagine. The propaganda was deliberate and systematic. German authorities understood that fear prevented surrender, and surrender, especially as military collapse became inevitable, threatened to accelerate defeat. So the warnings grew darker. Radio broadcasts described captured German soldiers forced into labor under brutal conditions, starved, abused, displayed as trophies. Female personnel heard worse. The warnings never gave explicit details that would undermine morale entirely, but spoke in vague, ominous terms about indignities, about treatment unbecoming, about fates that required women to choose death as the honorable alternative. Greta's mother, in her final letter, begged her daughter to avoid capture at all costs. "Better to come home by any means necessary," she wrote, "than to endure what we hear happens to our girls in enemy hands." The letter revealed how deeply propaganda penetrated civilian consciousness, how thoroughly it shaped expectations. Greta kept that letter in her jacket pocket, folded small, a reminder of what she fought to prevent. Now, standing in the American medical tent with her braid exposed and her cap removed, Greta waits for confirmation of everything she fears. The cutting of hair served multiple purposes in propaganda narratives: humiliation, dehumanization, a visible marker of defeat and powerlessness. Hair represented femininity, identity, autonomy, everything war sought to strip away. Greta's braid took years to grow, braided each morning by her mother before she left for training, then by her own hands in barracks and bunkers and freezing transport trucks. It connected her to who she was before the war, before the uniform, before the fear. Losing it would mean losing that last thread of self. The American nurse moves closer, and Greta braces herself. She thinks of Liesel beside her, whose dark curls frame a face still round with youth. She thinks of Anna, whose gray-streaked hair speaks of years spent managing impossible logistics under impossible pressure. She thinks of Marguerite, whose short practical haircut already looks military, efficient, stripped of vanity. They all wait, breath held, for the inevitable, but the nurse does not reach for scissors. She reaches instead for something else entirely, something that will transform this moment from confirmation of fears into revelation of unexpected truth. But then something unexpected happened. The American nurse captain Mary Sullivan, 31 years old, Army Nurse Corps, veteran of campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, picks up not scissors but a comb. A simple wooden comb, worn smooth with use, the kind found in any field medical kit. She steps toward Greta, movements deliberate but gentle, and begins to examine her braid, not with intent to cut, but with the careful attention of someone checking for lice, for wounds, for the medical conditions that accompany months in field conditions. Her hands move through Greta's hair with professional detachment, parting sections, inspecting the scalp, checking for signs of infection or infestation that might require treatment. Greta stands frozen, confused. This is not the script propaganda prepared her for. Captain Sullivan says something in English, her tone matter of fact, and the interpreter translates, "Your hair is clean. No treatment necessary. You can re-braid it after we complete the examination." The words make no sense at first. Greta's mind struggles to reconcile them with months of expectation, with certainty about what this moment would bring. The nurse moves on to Liesel, repeating the same examination, the same verdict. No scissors. No humiliation. Just medical protocol, executed with the same professional courtesy extended to any patient. Around the tent, realization spread slowly, like warmth returning to frozen limbs. The women exchange glances, uncertain whether to believe what they are experiencing. Marguerite whispers a question to the interpreter. "You will not cut our hair?" The interpreter looks puzzled by the question, as though it never occurred to him that anyone would. "No," he says simply. "Why would we? This is a medical examination, not a punishment." The examination continues for the next hour, thorough but respectful. Captain Sullivan and two other nurses, Lieutenant Jane Morrison, 26, from Iowa, and Lieutenant Ruth Cohen, 28, from New York, check vital signs, examine feet for frostbite and trench foot, inspect hands for wounds and infections. They ask questions to the interpreter about medical history, about symptoms, about pain or discomfort. They treat each prisoner not as an enemy, but as a patient, a distinction that revolutionizes everything. Greta watches Captain Sullivan work, trying to understand. The nurse's hands move with practiced efficiency, but also with something else, something Greta finally identifies as basic human consideration. When examining Anna's feet, swollen and blistered from weeks of marching in inadequate boots, Captain Sullivan winces sympathetically and calls for foot powder and clean socks. When Liesel begins to cry from relief or confusion or exhaustion, Lieutenant Morrison offers a clean handkerchief and a moment to compose herself. When Marguerite flinches at the touch of a stethoscope, Lieutenant Cohen explains each step of the examination through the interpreter, asking permission before proceeding. This is wrong, Greta thinks. Not morally wrong, the opposite, but wrong according to everything she was taught to expect. Enemies do not ask permission. Enemies do not offer handkerchiefs. Enemies do not wince in sympathy at blistered feet. The cognitive dissonance makes her dizzy, as though the ground beneath her feet has shifted and she must relearn how to stand. Captain Sullivan finishes the examinations and consults with her colleagues. They speak in low voices, reviewing notes on clipboards, making decisions about treatment priorities. Then Captain Sullivan addresses the group through the interpreter. "You will be assigned to barracks, given clean uniforms, and provided with adequate rations. Medical staff will monitor your health daily. You are prisoners of war, subject to the Geneva Conventions, and will be treated accordingly. Do you have questions?" The question itself is revolutionary. Greta realizes she has never been asked if she has questions, not by Wehrmacht officers, not by propaganda officials, not by anyone in authority throughout her entire military service. The invitation to speak, to ask, to participate even minimally in decisions about her own fate, this is as unexpected as the absent scissors. Liesel raises her hand tentatively, like a schoolgirl. "What happens to us now?" she asks. Captain Sullivan's expression softens slightly. "You recover," she says through the interpreter. "You rest. You eat, you heal. And then, when the war ends, you go home." The simplicity of it breaks something in Greta, some wall built from months of fear and propaganda and certainty about enemy cruelty. She feels tears prick her eyes and blinks them back furiously, refusing to cry in front of captors, refusing to show weakness. But the tears come anyway, silent and unstoppable, and she is not alone. Around her, other women weep quietly, shoulders shaking, hands covering faces. They cry not from fear but from relief, from the sudden release of tension held too long, from the overwhelming strangeness of being treated like human beings by people they were taught to regard as monsters. The propaganda was deliberate and systematic. German authorities understood that fear prevented surrender, and surrender, especially as military collapse became inevitable, threatened to accelerate defeat. So the warnings grew darker. Radio broadcasts described captured German soldiers forced into labor under brutal conditions, starved, abused, displayed as trophies. Female personnel heard worse. The warnings never gave explicit details that would undermine morale entirely, but spoke in vague, ominous terms about indignities, about treatment unbecoming, about fates that required women to choose death as the honorable alternative. Captain Sullivan distributes clean towels and allows them time to compose themselves. She does not comment on the tears, does not treat them as weakness or victory. She simply waits, patient and professional, until the women are ready to proceed. Then she leads them out of the medical tent and toward the barracks that will house them for the duration of their captivity. Greta touches her braid as she walks, feeling its familiar weight and texture. Still there. Still hers. The symbolism overwhelms her. If they left her hair, what else might remain? The reality of American prisoner of war treatment in 1944 contradicted German propaganda so thoroughly that captured personnel often suspected deception, some temporary kindness, designed to extract information before true brutality began. But the kindness was not temporary, and the treatment was not deception. It was policy, enforced systematically across all Allied POW facilities in accordance with international law and military doctrine, the 1929 Geneva Convention. Relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, established comprehensive standards for POW treatment. Signed by 47 nations including the United States, Great Britain, and Germany. The convention mandated that prisoners receive adequate food, shelter, medical care, and protection from violence and humiliation. Article 3 specifically prohibited violence to life in person, cruel treatment, and torture, while Article 4 required that prisoners be treated with humanity and protected especially against acts of violence, insults, and public curiosity. Article 7 addressed the specific issue of personal dignity. Prisoners of war shall be treated with regard to food, quarters, and clothing on the same basis as troops of the capturing power. The United States took these obligations seriously, implementing them through detailed regulations issued by the War Department. Field Manual 27-10, Rules of Land Warfare, codified Geneva Convention standards into American military law. Section 78 specified that prisoners of war are in the power of the hostile government, but not of the individuals or corps who captured them, establishing that POW welfare was a command responsibility, not subject to individual soldier discretion. Section 85 required that prisoners of war shall be provided with sufficient food, equivalent in quantity and quality to rations provided to base troops. Section 86 mandated suitable quarters with adequate heating, lighting, and sanitation. That by October 1944, the United States held approximately 360,000 German prisoners of war in facilities across North America and Europe. Of these, roughly 12,000 were women, primarily signals operators, administrative personnel, nurses, and support staff captured during the retreat through France and Belgium. Female prisoners received identical Geneva Convention protections as male prisoners, with additional provisions addressing gender-specific needs. They were housed in separate barracks, examined by female medical personnel when available, and given uniforms appropriate to their sex. Daily rations for German POWs in American custody averaged 4,000 calories, substantially more than the 2,000 to 2,500 calories available to German civilians under wartime rationing. A typical daily menu included oatmeal or eggs for breakfast, soup and sandwiches for lunch, and meat with vegetables for dinner, plus coffee, bread, and occasional desserts. These rations reflected Field Manual specifications requiring POW food to match the garrison ration of the United States Army, which was itself one of the most generous military rations in the world. Medical care followed similar standards. The American Army Nurse Corps, numbering approximately 59,000 personnel by late 1944, provided care to wounded soldiers and prisoners alike. Nurses received training in international law and Geneva Convention requirements, emphasizing that medical treatment made no distinction between friend and enemy. Captain Mary Sullivan's examination of Greta and the other women reflected standard medical protocol: check for infectious diseases, document injuries and medical conditions, initiate treatment as necessary, and maintain ongoing health monitoring. The contrast with conditions in Germany was stark and growing starker as the war progressed. By autumn 1944, German rations for military personnel had dropped to approximately 2,500 calories daily, and civilian rations hovered around 2,000 calories. Medical supplies were critically short. German field hospitals operated without adequate anesthesia, antibiotics, or basic surgical supplies. Captured Allied personnel in German POW camps received rations well below Geneva Convention standards, roughly 1,500 to 2,000 calories daily, supplemented only by Red Cross parcels that German authorities often delayed or confiscated. The American commitment to Geneva Convention standards was not altruistic sentiment, but calculated policy. Military leadership understood that POW treatment was reciprocal. How America treated German prisoners influenced how Germany treated captured Americans. Reports from German POW camps, transmitted through neutral Swiss inspectors, revealed generally adequate treatment for American prisoners. Treatment that leadership attributed partly to Germany's awareness of the 360,000 German prisoners held in American custody. Maintaining high standards for German POWs thus served strategic interests, protecting American personnel in enemy hands. The propaganda was deliberate and systematic. German authorities understood that fear prevented surrender, and surrender, especially as military collapse became inevitable, threatened to accelerate defeat. So the warnings grew darker. Radio broadcasts described captured German soldiers forced into labor under brutal conditions, starved, abused, displayed as trophies. Female personnel heard worse. The warnings never gave explicit details that would undermine morale entirely, but spoke in vague, ominous terms about indignities, about treatment unbecoming, about fates that required women to choose death as the honorable alternative. But policy alone does not explain the compassion Greta observed in Captain Sullivan's examination. Policy required adequate medical care. It did not require sympathy for blistered feet or handkerchiefs for tears. The humanity Greta encountered reflected something deeper than regulation or conviction. Among American medical personnel, that treating prisoners with dignity was not just legal obligation, but moral imperative. Statistical evidence supports this pattern. Red Cross inspection reports from American POW facilities in 1944 documented compliance rates exceeding 95% for food, shelter, medical care, and sanitation standards. Mortality rates among German POWs in American custody remained below 1% lower than mortality rates among American soldiers in training camps. Incident reports of prisoner abuse existed, but were rare, and when discovered, prosecuted under military law. For Greta Fischer and the 11 women captured with her, these statistics translated into lived experience: clean barracks with adequate heating, 3 meals daily that left them genuinely full for the first time in months, medical attention that addressed chronic conditions ignored during Wehrmacht service. The dissonance between expectation and reality forced a complete reassessment of everything propaganda had taught them about American brutality, and at the center of that reassessment was one small object that appeared again and again, a symbol of care that no propaganda prepared them for. Number convention required, no regulation mandated, but which transformed captivity from endurance into something approaching hope. The coffee appears the first morning, served in the mess hall at 07:00 hours. Real coffee, not the ersatz grain-based substitute German soldiers have choked down for 2 years. Greta wraps both hands around the tin cup, feeling warmth seep into fingers still cramped from weeks of cold. She inhales the steam-rich, bitter, unmistakably real, and something inside her chest loosens. Coffee. Americans give their prisoners coffee. It seems impossibly frivolous. Food is survival. Shelter is survival. Medical care is survival. But coffee is luxury, pleasure, the small grace note that makes survival worth pursuing. Greta sips carefully, letting the heat and bitterness spread across her tongue, and feels herself begin to thaw in ways that have nothing to do with temperature. Around her, other women react similarly: surprise, then pleasure, then something like bewilderment. They exchange glances that ask the same question: why do our captors give us this? The coffee reappears at lunch, strong and black in the same tin cups. Reappears again at dinner, accompanied by powdered milk and sugar. That turns the bitter brew sweet and pale. Greta watches an American corporal refill cups without being asked, moving along the table with casual generosity, and she realizes this is not special treatment. This is standard. American soldiers drink coffee, therefore American prisoners drink coffee. The simplicity of that logic, the assumption of basic equivalence, challenges everything. In the Wehrmacht, rations varied by rank. Officers ate better than enlisted personnel. Combat troops received more than support staff. Hierarchies of value determined who got adequate food, who got adequate warmth, who got attention when wounded. Greta, as a signals operator, ranked low in that hierarchy. She grew accustomed to cold coffee substitutes, to thin soup, to the understanding that her needs mattered less than the needs of men in combat positions. Propaganda framed this as necessary sacrifice, as proper order. She never questioned it until now, when American captors serve her real coffee and assume she deserves it simply because she is human and humans drink coffee. Captain Sullivan appears in the mess hall during dinner, making rounds, checking on the new prisoners. She stops at Greta's table, asks through the interpreter how everyone is feeling, whether the food is adequate, whether anyone needs additional medical attention. Her gaze lands on Greta's coffee cup, and she smiles slightly, the first real smile Greta has seen from her. "You like the coffee?" she asks. The interpreter translates, and Greta nods, suddenly shy. "Good," Captain Sullivan says. "There's always more. Help yourself." The permission to help herself, to take more without asking, without justifying need, without hierarchy determining worthiness, strikes Greta as revolutionary. She thinks of Wehrmacht mess halls where taking extra rations meant punishment, where need always exceeded supply, where survival required learning to want less. Here, abundance is assumed. Here, desire for coffee is legitimate reason to have coffee. The shift in worldview required to accept this feels tectonic. That night, Greta lies in her barracks bunk, a real bunk, with mattress and blankets and a pillow, and tries to articulate what the coffee means. It is not the caffeine, though that helps. It is not even the taste, though that is lovely. It is the message embedded in the gesture. You matter enough to receive small pleasures. Your comfort has value. We see you as person, not just prisoner. The coffee becomes a touchstone, a measure by which Greta gauges the truth of her new reality. Each cup confirms that the first day was not anomaly, that the kindness is not temporary. On the third day, when supplies arrive from a depot camp farther west, the coffee improves, darker roast, richer flavor. On the fifth day, Liesel discovers that asking for extra sugar brings extra sugar. No questions asked, no rationing enforced. On the seventh day, a new prisoner, a woman named Hilde, captured near the German border, arrives expecting horrors and instead receives coffee. And Greta watches her face transform exactly as her own. Must have transformed a week earlier. The propaganda was deliberate and systematic. German authorities understood that fear prevented surrender, And surrender, especially as military collapse became inevitable, threatened to accelerate defeat. So the warnings grew darker. Radio broadcasts described captured German soldiers forced into labor under brutal conditions, starved, abused, displayed as trophies. Female personnel heard worse. The warnings never gave explicit details that would undermine morale entirely, but spoke in vague, ominous terms about indignities, about treatment unbecoming, about fates that required women to choose death as the honorable alternative. The coffee also becomes a social lubricant, a bridge across language barriers and ideological divides. American guards drink coffee during their shifts, leaning against walls in the mess hall, tin cups in hand. Sometimes they nod at the German prisoners, acknowledging shared appreciation for the brew. Sometimes they joke with each other in English, laughter punctuating words Greta cannot understand, and the laughter sounds normal, human, unforced. She begins to recognize individual guards, the tall corporal from Montana, the short sergeant from New Jersey, the lieutenant who always looks tired, not by name but by their coffee rituals. Montana takes his black. New Jersey adds 3 sugars. The tired lieutenant drinks cup after cup throughout his shift, staying awake through visible exhaustion. One morning, the tired lieutenant, Lieutenant James Caldwell, 24, drafted straight from law school, sits at a table adjacent to where Greta and Anna are finishing breakfast. He sips his coffee, stares at nothing in particular, and sighs deeply. The interpreter, passing by, pauses and says something to him in English. Lieutenant Caldwell laughs ruefully and responds. And the interpreter translates for Greta and Anna. He says the coffee is the only thing keeping him sane. It is the first personal statement any American soldier has made in their presence. The first glimpse of shared humanity beneath uniforms and roles. Anna, emboldened, asks through the interpreter, "How long have you been here?" Lieutenant Caldwell looks surprised to be addressed, then considers. 18 months, he says. North Africa, Sicily, France. I haven't slept more than 4 hours straight since Tunisia. He drains his coffee, stands, and adds, "But at least the coffee's good. Hang on to small mercies, right?" He walks away before they can respond, but the exchange lingers. Hang on to small mercies. It sounds like advice from someone who understands captivity of a different kind, the captivity of war itself, which holds soldier and prisoner alike. The coffee appears again in Greta's story on the 20th day, during a conversation with Captain Sullivan that changes everything. Greta has been assigned light duty in the camp hospital, helping with laundry and basic cleaning under nurse supervision. Captain Sullivan finds her folding bandages in the supply room and invites her to take a break. They sit in the small nurse's office, and Captain Sullivan pours 2 cups of coffee from a percolator on the desk. She offers sugar and powdered milk, and they prepare their coffee in companionable silence. Then Captain Sullivan asks, through the interpreter who accompanies all such interactions, "Why did you think we would cut your hair?" The question, so direct, catches Greta off guard. She struggles to explain propaganda, warnings, stories whispered in barracks. Captain Sullivan listens intently, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something that might be anger. Though not directed at Greta, "We would never," she says quietly. "That would violate every principle we're fighting for. We're not here to humiliate you. We're here to treat you as human beings governed by the same laws that protect our own soldiers." Greta wants to believe this. The coffee in her hands, the warmth, the generosity, the small mercy, argues for belief. But years of propaganda are not undone in 20 days. What happens, she asks hesitantly, when the war ends? What happens to us then? Captain Sullivan sips her coffee, considering. "You go home," she says simply. "You're repatriated. That's the law." She pauses, then adds, "I know you don't trust us yet. I understand why. But I need you to understand something too. We're not monsters. Neither are you. We're just people caught in something bigger than ourselves, trying to get through it with our humanity intact. The speech is more personal than any previous interaction, and Greta senses the weight behind it, the exhaustion, the moral burden of war, the effort required to maintain humanity when everything encouraged brutality. Captain Sullivan finishes her coffee and returns to work, leaving Greta alone with her thoughts and half a cup of coffee gone cold. That night, Greta writes her first letter home. Prisoners are permitted to send mail, monitored but uncensored beyond security concerns. She writes to her mother, describing the camp, the food, the barracks. She writes, "They give us coffee. Real coffee. Every day. I don't know why I'm telling you this, except it feels important. It feels like proof of something I'm still learning to believe. The coffee, that small recurring mercy, carries more meaning than its weight in beans. The transformation in Greta's understanding begins with coffee and continues through participation. American policy permits prisoners to volunteer for work assignments, light labor, nothing directly supporting the war effort, compensated with small wages and additional privileges. Greta volunteers for hospital duty, partly from boredom and partly from curiosity about the nurses who treated her with such unexpected compassion. The work is simple: laundry, basic cleaning, inventory of supplies. But proximity to American medical staff reveals patterns Greta never noticed from a distance. She watches Captain Sullivan and the other nurses work 12-hour shifts, treating wounded soldiers, American, British, and German alike, with identical professional care. She sees them advocate for their patients, arguing with supply officers for better equipment, with commanding officers for more rest. She sees them comfort dying men, holding hands and speaking softly, regardless of which flag those men fought under. One afternoon, a transport arrives carrying wounded from recent fighting near the Siegfried Line. Among them are 3 German soldiers, 2 with serious injuries. Greta watches Captain Sullivan examine them, her hands gentle despite the Wehrmacht uniforms, her orders to other nurses crisp and urgent. One German soldier, conscious and terrified, asks in broken English, "You help me? Really help?" Captain Sullivan does not speak German, but her interpreter translates her response. "Of course. You're my patient." The simplicity of it, the categorical inclusion, moves Greta to tears. She begins to understand that the coffee, the clean barracks, the absent scissors, none of it is propaganda designed to extract intelligence or cooperation. It is genuine commitment to principle, enacted daily by people who choose humanity over expedience, even when exhausted, even when treating enemy personnel, even when no one is watching to applaud their virtue. The propaganda was deliberate and systematic. German authorities understood that fear prevented surrender, and surrender, especially as military collapse became inevitable, threatened to accelerate defeat. So the warnings grew darker. Radio broadcasts described captured German soldiers forced into labor under brutal conditions, starved, abused, displayed as trophies. Female personnel heard worse. The warnings never gave explicit details that would undermine morale entirely, but spoke in vague, ominous terms about indignities, about treatment unbecoming, about fates that required women to choose death as the honorable alternative. Liesel volunteers for mess hall duty and discovers similar patterns. The American cooks, mostly enlisted men from farming states, drafted into support roles, treat food preparation as moral obligation. They follow recipes precisely, measure portions carefully, ensure nothing is wasted. When Liesel accidentally drops a tray of bread, the head cook, Sergeant Raymond Parker, 38, from Kansas, helps her clean up and simply says, "Happens to everyone. Don't worry about it." The absence of punishment, of anger, of hierarchy enforced through humiliation, astonishes her. She writes in her own letter home, "They are kind the way ordinary people are kind. Not for show, but because they do not know how else to be. Anna volunteers for administrative work, helping translate documents and organize files. She works alongside American clerks and discovers they are mostly conscripts who miss home, who complain about the war, who show her photographs of wives and children and parents. One clerk, Private Thomas Chun, 22, from San Francisco, shows Anna a picture of his mother, a Chinese immigrant who worked in a laundry for 30 years to send him to college. She told me to remember everyone's mother loves them the same, he says through the interpreter. Even the Germans, even the enemy. Everyone's somebody's kid. The wisdom in that statement, its deliberate contradiction of propaganda that dehumanizes enemies, strikes Anna as profoundly subversive. She realizes that Americans receive their own propaganda, their own encouragement to hate, but individuals resist it. They choose to see prisoners as somebody's kid, somebody's beloved child, somebody worth treating with basic human decency, despite uniforms and flags and ideological divides. Marguerite, the oldest and initially most skeptical, volunteers for the motor pool, helping maintain vehicles. She works alongside mechanics who teach her American maintenance techniques, different from German methods but equally effective. The head mechanic, Warrant Officer John Kowalski, 41, from Michigan, is a second-generation Polish immigrant who speaks enough German to communicate directly. He tells her, "My parents fled Europe because of pogroms. They came to America because they wanted to live somewhere people aren't killed for being different. That's what we're fighting for, not to destroy Germany, but to destroy the idea that some people deserve destruction." His words challenge Marguerite's understanding of American motivations. Propaganda portrayed Allied forces as vengeful, destructive, intent on annihilating German culture and people. But Kowalski speaks of fighting for a principle, for the possibility of a world where difference does not equal danger. Marguerite does not know if she believes him. Too much history argues against such optimism, but she cannot dismiss him either. His sincerity is too evident, his kindness too consistent. The women begin to discuss these experiences during evening hours in their barracks. They compare observations, test interpretations, collectively reassess what they believed about their captors. The conversations are tentative at first. Years of propaganda create habits of thought not easily abandoned, but grow bolder as evidence accumulates. Greta articulates what others feel. Either we were lied to about everything, or this camp is an elaborate deception. And I don't think they can afford to maintain deception for 360,000 prisoners. This must be real. The number 360,000 German POWs in American custody by late 1944 transforms individual experience into systematic evidence. No military can sustain elaborate deception at that scale. The resources required to maintain false kindness for hundreds of thousands of prisoners would exceed the resources required to simply treat them well. Logic dictates that what Greta and her companions experience must be genuine policy, not temporary manipulation. Their transformation is not complete. Trust builds slowly, and caution remains rational, but a fundamental shift has occurred. They begin to see American soldiers not as enemy abstractions, but as individuals with names and stories and mothers who love them. They begin to recognize shared humanity beneath ideological conflict. And they begin to imagine that survival might include dignity, that captivity might include mercy, that enemies might choose to be something better than propaganda insists. The transformation appears most clearly in small moments. Greta laughing at a joke one of the guards makes, translated by the interpreter. Liesel teaching an American nurse a German song, humming the melody until the nurse picks it up. Anna and Private Chen working side by side in comfortable silence, no longer needing to fill every moment with translated conversation. Marguerite showing Warrant Officer Kowalski a better way to adjust carburetor timing. Professional pride overcoming national allegiance. These moments accumulate into something larger than their individual weight suggests. They become evidence that war, for all its propaganda and dehumanization, cannot entirely suppress the human impulse toward connection. That even in captivity, especially in captivity, small gestures of recognition and respect can bridge divides propaganda insists are unbridgeable. And every morning, the coffee reappears, reliable as dawn, proof that some mercies persist even when the world insists on cruelty. 20 years later, October 1964. New York City. Greta Fisher Sullivan. 43 years old, naturalized American citizen. Registered nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital, stands in the arrivals hall at JFK Airport, scanning the crowd for a face she has not seen in 2 decades. Her hair, still blonde but now cut short in a modern style, is tucked behind her ears. Her hands twist the strap of her purse nervously. Beside her, her daughter Sarah, 17, born in America, fluent in English with only traces of her mother's accent, watches the arriving passengers with curiosity. "Are you sure she recognizes you?" Sarah asks. Greta smiles. "I'm sure I'll recognize her." And then she does. Captain Mary Sullivan, now Dr. Mary Sullivan. 51, retired from military service. Professor of nursing at Columbia University, emerges from customs. And despite 20 years and the civilian clothes and the gray threading through auburn hair, Greta knows her immediately. Their eyes meet across the crowd, and both women freeze for a heartbeat. Then they move toward each other, weaving through travelers, closing the distance between then and now. The propaganda was deliberate and systematic. German authorities understood that fear prevented surrender, and surrender, especially as military collapse became inevitable, threatened to accelerate defeat. So the warnings grew darker. Radio broadcasts described captured German soldiers forced into labor under brutal conditions, starved, abused, displayed as trophies. Female personnel heard worse. The warnings never gave explicit details that would undermine morale entirely, but spoke in vague, ominous terms about indignities, about treatment unbecoming, about fates that required women to choose death as the honorable alternative. They embrace without words, holding on perhaps longer than strangers would consider appropriate, but they are not strangers and never were. When they finally pull apart, both are crying quiet tears, surprised by their own emotion. Mary speaks first. "You wrote. I didn't think you'd actually write." "I wrote 3 weeks after going home," Greta says in English, accented but fluent. "And every year after." "You never responded." Mary shakes her head. "Military mail regulations. We weren't permitted to correspond with former prisoners. I kept your letters anyway. All of them. I wanted to respond so badly, to tell you I was glad you made it home. That I hoped you were well." They move to a quieter corner of the terminal, and Greta introduces Sarah. Mary shakes her daughter's hand solemnly, then turns back to Greta. Tell me everything. The letters gave me pieces, but I want the whole story." So Greta tells her. She describes the journey home in early 1945, processed through a repatriation center in France, transported by train through devastated German cities to Berlin. She describes finding her mother's apartment building destroyed by bombing, her mother relocated to a cousin's home in Bavaria. She describes the stunned relief of reunion, the difficulty of explaining where she had been, what she had experienced. "No one believed me about the coffee," Greta says, and both women laugh, recognizing the absurdity and profundity of that detail. She describes post-war Germany, the rubble, the hunger, the occupation, the slow reconstruction. She describes realizing that American occupation forces treated German civilians with the same principles that governed POW camps. Geneva Conventions applied, rations distributed, medical care provided. She describes understanding that what she experienced in the camp was not exception but pattern, not deception but genuine commitment to principle. "I decided to become a nurse," Greta says, "because of you." Because of how you treated us, not like enemies, just like people who needed care. I wanted to do that. I wanted to be someone who sees people, not uniforms. Mary's eyes fill with tears again. You did, she says softly. You became that. Greta continues. She applied to nursing school in 1947. Completed training in 1950. She worked in German hospitals, treating occupation soldiers and German civilians alike, practicing the non-discrimination she learned in captivity. She met an American GI, Robert Sullivan, from New York, stationed in Frankfurt, who shared her commitment to healing rather than hierarchy. They married in 1951, immigrated to the United States in 1952. Started a family. I am an immigrant, Greta says, because Americans taught me that enemies can become neighbors, that captors can become family. Robert's parents were terrified when he brought home a German wife. His mother cried, convinced I was dangerous. But then she met me, and I was just a woman. A nurse, someone who loved her son. And we became family. She describes America in the 1950s and early 1960s, the suspicion she sometimes faced, the assumptions about her politics and loyalties, the occasional hostility, but also the acceptance, the opportunities, the possibility of building a life defined by choices rather than history. She describes naturalizing as a citizen in 1958, voting in her first election in 1960, teaching Sarah to be proud of her dual heritage, German and American. Daughter of former enemies who chose love over legacy. Statistics bear out Greta's experience between 1945 and 1965. Approximately 250,000 German war brides and displaced persons immigrated to the United States, many marrying American servicemen, others seeking opportunity in a country that offered reconstruction rather than retribution. The wave of immigration transformed American demographics and challenged post-war narratives about permanent enmity. Mary shares her own trajectory. She remained in the Army Nurse Corps through 1950. Serving in occupation Germany and then in Korea, she witnessed the immediate post-war period in Europe, the Marshall Plan rebuilding, the Berlin airlift, the evolution from occupied enemy to allied partner. She saw former prisoners working alongside former captors to reconstruct shattered infrastructure, and the collaboration seemed natural consequence of the principles established in POW camps. If you treat people with dignity during war, she says, they remember that dignity when peace comes. She retired from military service in 1950, completed a doctorate in nursing education, and joined the Columbia faculty in 1955. She spent 15 years teaching new generations of nurses the principles she practiced in war: non-discrimination, Geneva Conventions, the moral obligation to see patients as people first. I tell my students about the German pose, she says, about how we treated you, about how humanity persists if we insist on it. Sarah, listening intently, asks, "Did you think you'd ever see each other again?" Both women shake their heads. "Never," Greta says. "I thought you were a moment in my life, an important moment, but finished. I didn't know moments could become lifelong." Mary smiles. "Neither did I." They leave the airport and drive to Greta's home in Queens, a modest 2-bedroom apartment, filled with photographs and books and comfortable furniture. Robert is at work, but Greta has prepared dinner. They sit around the kitchen table, and Greta pours coffee strong and black, exactly how they drank it 20 years ago. The smell fills the kitchen. The propaganda was deliberate and systematic. German authorities understood that fear prevented surrender, and surrender, especially as military collapse became inevitable, threatened to accelerate defeat. So the warnings grew darker. Radio broadcasts described captured German soldiers forced into labor under brutal conditions, starved, abused, displayed as trophies. Female personnel heard worse. The warnings never gave explicit details that would undermine morale entirely, but spoke in vague, ominous terms about indignities, about treatment unbecoming, about fates that required women to choose death as the honorable alternative.